I wish you also a happy new year. Welcome to 2026. I remember when I was a younger man and was writing software for a company in Minneapolis. And at the time, I was 20. I remember it vividly. I don't know how I can remember it. I can't better remember my name now. But I remember thinking to myself, it's a long time until the year 2000. Now I can say it's a long time back to 2000. But nonetheless, I welcome you to this new year. Pray that the Lord will grant you a good one, that he will pour out his mercies upon you over the course of this year. And as we start a new year, we'll start a new sermon series. Or at least we'll pretend to get one started. And I say that because I'm going to preach this morning an introduction sermon to a new book, and then I'm going to take the next 2 weeks off. I'm going to take next week off because I am having this Friday a pacemaker installed. Now, everything is okay. My heart is strong. Valves are good. Everything looks good. The plumber says my heart looks good, but the electrician says that I need some new wiring. So I'm going to need a pacemaker to deal with the electrical side of the house. So that's taking place on Friday. I would appreciate your prayers for that. And then, Lord willing, 3 of us from the church are heading to Costa Rica the next week to go and observe Chesapeake's ordination. He is being set aside, ordained to the gospel ministry, although it's kind of strange. He's been preaching the gospel for a very long time, but this will be an official laying on of hands that he's passed all the necessary theological tests to be ordained. And so we're going to go down and observe that. So that's the next 2 Sundays for me. Brian Roden will be standing in for me and preaching over these next 2 weeks. So pray for him as he comes. I want to begin, or at least pretend to begin this morning, a series from the book of Malachi, the last book of your Old Testament, the Italian prophet Malachi. It's an old joke. I don't know. I just had to say it. Okay. Malachi, a little minor prophet at the end of the Old Testament. And which is my custom, of course, is to give an introduction sermon to the book before we actually start exegeting the book itself. And I picked this book for a number of reasons. I want to use this book as some mortar, M-O-R-T-A-R, some mortar between 2 other larger preaching endeavors. We finished one last year in a whole year in the book of Colossians, and I would like to start a series through the book of 1 Corinthians. But I don't want to just rush into that from Colossians, so I'm going to put, which is typical for me, I do this, to take a little book and stick it in between and preach it through. It's just to have a little thing. I did it with Jonah, I did it with Ruth, I did it with Esther, I've done it with a number of the littler books of the Old Testament over time. So that's what I want to do here, because I have no idea how long it'll take to do 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians behind it. So we need a little mortar in between. Additionally, this book comes to me somewhat pre-prepared because I did a series through it recently in what we now call the former men's Bible study, not too long ago. So I've just recently finished a study through it, and so it's sort of on my heart and on my mind. And so I thought it would be a good thing to do. And then additionally, like Jonah, it is a short study of a minor prophet that is, I would say, obtusely relevant to our day. Okay, it's relevant, somewhat obtusely. So we'll see that as we're going through the book. And so we want to start with an overview of this book, and we want to talk about its context, we want to talk about its background, its historical context, etc. But I'll start by just reminding you again that the last 12 books of the Old Testament were dubbed by Augustine as the minor prophets. Now notice I put that in quotes because they're not minor in the sense of their theological content. No, they express very much all the same things that the major prophets said. So if you read everything from Hosea to Malachi, you will get what you see in the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel. You'll get all the same subjects, just much shorter, much more terse, rather than the very long-winded nature of these larger books, which is another reason that I like preaching to them, because I can get a condensed version of some of the major prophets through them all. Now, the 12 that you see are not in chronological order in your Bible, although Malachi is, in fact, at the end of the list. The others are not in chronological order, but this one is. They're not in chronological order, but they were, by the time of Christ himself, in the order you have them in your Bible. So even by Jesus' day, Hosea to Malachi were in this order in the Old Testament. In fact, these 12 were originally combined together as a single scroll in the Hebrew Scriptures. So you could take one scroll and they were all there. As I said, they're called minor prophets based on their size, not their worth or importance. In fact, if you took all 12 of the books and put them in a scroll, it would not equal the size of Jeremiah by itself. So you took all of the words of these 12 and put it together, it wouldn't even be as long as Jeremiah. Now, let's talk about the background of the book itself. We need to know the historical reality of this letter, this prophetic utterance. When did this come? And I would argue with you that if you're not a fan of history, you may find the next 15 minutes to be boring, but I would encourage you to consider what we're saying, because you really cannot understand Malachi unless you understand the historical background here, okay? What this prophet is going to write about is directly related to where it sits in time. So let me back up all the way back to the beginning of Israel, and we'll get a running start into where we are. The history of Israel can be divided into 5 major sections. I'm going to actually say it's really only 4, okay? But most would say 5. And the first period is what we would call the period of the Judges. So this would be the period after Israel comes out of Egypt, crosses the Red Sea, goes to Sinai, takes Canaan, and does what you see in Joshua to take the initial conquest of the land. And then it becomes a period of the Judges. So basically from Joshua to David in 1010. So from about 1446 to 1010, roughly a period of about 400 years. So the books of Joshua and Judges and Ruth and 1 Samuel through Saul's reign is in this period of time. Following that then is the second period called the United Kingdom under David and Solomon, from about 1010 BC to about 930 BC, a period of about 80 years, where these 2 great kings led this nation of Israel. At this point, by the time of Solomon, Israel could be considered an empire to a large extent. Its influence stretched way to the south into Africa, to the east, and to the north. There's strong empirical sense of this nation at this particular period of time. So 2 Samuel, or the latter half of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 1 Chronicles, which we're reading through, and 2 Chronicles 1 to 9, is this period of the United Kingdom under David and Solomon. The third period then, of course, is the longest one, and that's the divided kingdom. And that's the period of time from David's reign all the way through to the Assyrian overthrow of the Babylonian overthrow of the southern kingdom. So all of 1 Kings 13 through 22, 2 Kings, and the latter half of 2 Chronicles. This period starts with the foolishness of Solomon's son, Rehoboam, who decides to implement his father's taxation policies when he shouldn't have. He was advised not to, and it caused a split between the northern part of Israel and the southern part of Israel. The northern part of Israel broke away in 930, give or take, under King Jeroboam, otherwise known as Jeroboam I from our perspective. And that part of the kingdom continued until its overthrow in 722 by the Assyrians. A succession of 19 evil kings, Jeroboam I through Hoshea, which were headquartered at the city of Samaria, which is where the territory of Samaria and the Samaritans got their name from. The northern kingdom was overthrown by Shalmaneser of Assyria, noted in 2 Kings 17:9. And there's a reason given for its downfall, and it's explicitly written in 2 Kings 17, verses 7 to 18. I'll read just a few verses. And this occurred, this exile of this northern kingdom occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord had drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. In other words, they were booted out of this place because they had embraced the gods of the people they had displaced and had begun to worship them and to not worship the one true God. You remember they established high places at Dan and Bethel to go instead of going to Jerusalem to the temple. And the northern part of Israel disappeared from the face of the earth in 721, 722 BC. The southern kingdom continued, however. It started also, of course, under Rehoboam in 930, but it continued all the way to the Babylonian exile in 586. And it was characterized by a succession of both good and evil kings. There were 8 good kings and 12 evil kings, all, of course, headquartered at Jerusalem. Even as I read this morning from David bringing the ark into Jerusalem, he had established Jerusalem as the capital city of Israel. When the northern kingdom broke away, decided to create a new capital, obviously. But the southern kingdom continued to headquarter itself at David's city. The southern kingdom continued then, as I said, until 586, when it was taken into exile by the Babylonian Nebuchadnezzar, recorded in 2 Kings 24 and 25, for virtually the same reasons that the northern kingdom went away. Even though they had the temple there in Jerusalem, and even though they had a closer connection to God by virtue of staying faithful to, mostly, staying faithful to the law, nonetheless, they embraced the gods of the peoples around them, abandoned the worship of the one true God, and were exiled for it. So the first period is the period of the judges. The second is the period of the United Kingdom, then the divided kingdom. And then the fourth, and I'm going to lump these both together. Some people split it into two, but I call it the post-exilic period. And some would then label another period called the intertestamental period. But I consider it one period that begins basically with the return of the remnant under Cyrus back into the land to repopulate it, and that continues all the way to the end of our Old Testament and even into the New. See, the reason I don't want to call that an intertestamental period is because if you stop and think about it for a second, the Old Testament continues all the way through the gospel accounts. Because the New Testament, the New Covenant, doesn't begin until the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. So the vast majority of what we have in the first 4 books of the New Testament is actually part of the Old. John the Baptist was an Old Testament prophet, not a New Testament prophet. And so I lump this as one period. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah are the historical books, which we would call the last narratives before this close of this period. As I mentioned a moment ago, the northern kingdom never returns. Okay, when the Assyrians take them away, the Assyrians attempt to repopulate the area that they came from. They had some struggles there. God sent some struggles against them. They sent a few priests in to try to satisfy the God of the Jews by going to that place, and they created this half-breed of Jewish people, which were known as the Samaritans. The southern kingdom, however, does come back to life in a sense. In about 516 BC, under Zerubbabel and Ezra, a remnant come back to this particular place to rebuild the temple and to reestablish themselves as a people. There are primarily 3 temples of the Israelite people. The first, of course, is the Solomonic temple that Solomon built, the great Solomonic temple, which was destroyed by the Babylonians when they swept in and took the southern kingdom away. And then there was a second temple built by these exiles that returned, and we call that the Second Temple. Very often you will hear scholars speak of Second Temple Judaism as that period of time of the Jews after the Second Temple is built. But there is a third, and the third temple is the one that Herod built. The great remodeling project that he started in about 40 BC that lasted until it was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans, who destroyed it, the one that Jesus went to. So there were really three. In fact, part of the Herodic temple is still there. It's called the Wailing Wall. It's there at the where the original temple stood, and the Jews wail there because their temple has been destroyed from that place. Malachi represents the last writing prophet of the Old Testament. He is the last writing prophet. He is the last one to be inspired by God to write scripturally in the period of time known as the Old Testament. So he is really the demarcation between the post-exilic period and the intertestamental period, if you want to have that as a separate period. He's the one that ends the post-exilic period of time. The author of the book is identified as a man by the name of Malachi. You see it in chapter 1, verse 1. The oracle of the Lord to Israel by Malachi. The word Malachi in Hebrew actually means my messenger or messenger of the Lord. It's possibly the same Malachiah of 2nd Esdras 140 in the Apocrypha. So there's a mention of a man by the similar name, and some believe that this is the same individual. Based on the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and the Targums, which are the commentaries by the rabbis of Israel, some have suggested that Malachi is actually a title and not a name, because he has the phrase, because it's the phrase, my messenger. Some suggest that the letter is anonymous. Some guy who was a messenger of God came and delivered this oracle. So Malachi is not actually his name, they would say, but rather simply his title, a messenger from God. However, given the similar pattern of the name of the prophet appearing in the opening of the book in all the other minor prophets, it seems likely to me that this is a reference to a specific person. In other words, every other of the 12 minor prophets, their name is specifically put at the beginning of the letter, the beginning of the prophecy. So why would this be different? Doesn't have to go there. So I'm inclined to believe that there is a literal man by the name of Malachi who brought this prophecy. So for me, Malachi becomes an interesting wordplay. If you look at chapter 3, verse 1, it says, behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. Now, we know that is a veiled reference to John the Baptist. We'll see that later. But it's an interesting play on words, isn't it? Here you have a messenger who comes to reveal a messenger who comes to reveal the ultimate messenger of God. See how this is relevant? Here is a messenger, Malachi, who comes to speak of a messenger, John, who comes to speak of the ultimate messenger of God, who is, of course, the Christ. It's the foreshadowing of a future messenger by an immediate one. Here we are. I want you to know, dear Israel, that God is going to send you a messenger. I'm coming to tell you that as a messenger. Now, the book offers no biographical information on the author itself. We don't know anything about him. Now, we undoubtedly realize he's of Israelite origin. He's clearly an Israelite. Given the fact that he knows about the Jewish priestly realities in the sacrificial system, he's familiar with the Mosaic covenant. He seems to have a an understanding of the history of Israel quite well, particularly the recent history of Israel. So there's no doubt that he is an Israelite, Hebrew author. But he is mentioned nowhere else in the Old Testament. He's mentioned nowhere else. He is just one man that God raised up to bring an oracle to the people and then disappears. Now, he is quoted in the New Testament. So this man by the name of Malachi, as I said, I think it's a man, this man by the name of Malachi is writing clearly after the second temple is built. The structure of this letter strongly suggests that this is written after Ezra and Zerubbabel build the temple, rebuild the temple, establish its foundations when they first arrive, and then rebuild that temple. You remember that after the initial wave of settlers returned under the decree of Cyrus, they came and they rebuilt the temple. And then, sometime later, Nehemiah gets it in his mind to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, which he then does. This all happens somewhere between about 445 to 425 BC. I should say it ends. It doesn't happen between. It ends somewhere in there. It starts about 516, and the work of Ezra, Zerubbabel, and Nehemiah all seems to finish up around 445 to 425 BC. So we can date this prophecy somewhere in the latter half of the 5th century BC, 450 to 400 BC, somewhere in there. At the end of the recorded history of Israel in the Old Testament. Now, there's a number of clues in the book that we know that that's the case. First of all, you will notice in chapter 3, verse 1, that the temple is mentioned. Behold, I send my messenger, and he'll prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. Seems to me reasonable that if you're going to make such a statement, such a temple exists for him to come to. So it seems likely that this is again written after that temple is built. There's another thing that's noted here by scholars, and that is in chapter 1, verse 8. It makes mention of governors. Verse 8, when you offer blind animals in sacrifice, is that not evil? Or when you offer those that are lame or sick, is that not evil? Present that to your governor. Will he accept you or show your favor? That word governor is a clue. It tells us that this is probably written during a time when the Israelites had governors over them, and that term is expressly used during the Persian period of Middle Eastern history. So sometime between about 539 and 332, when the Persians dominated the Mediterranean. The Persian Empire, now known as Iran, had at that time, they were the great empire of the time. They replaced the Babylonians, who had replaced the Assyrians. And so they became the world power during this roughly 200-year period of time from 539 to 332. Given the use of that term, it seems likely that Malachi is being written during that period. So he's being written during the period of Persian dominance. Additionally, one more piece of evidence is that there are a number of parallel sins reproved by Malachi that are similar to those of Ezra and Nehemiah's time, suggesting that they had time to grow and become a serious problem. So they're introduced in Ezra and Nehemiah's time, but by now they have flowered into a full-blown rebellion in Israelite history. So that puts Malachi later in the post-exilic period, after Ezra and Nehemiah. These sins have flowered into the fullness of their nature. We'll come back to that in a minute. So Malachi is probably written somewhere around, let's just say 425. Let's split the difference, 425 BC. As I said earlier, this book is written about 100 years after the initial wave of Jewish refugees had returned to their homeland under Cyrus, just before 516 BC. You remember that 42,360 plus an additional 7,537 had returned. That number is explicitly noted in Ezra 2:64 and following. When this roughly 50,000 or so returned, they returned under Ezra and Zerubbabel and laid the foundation of the temple, were opposed for a brief time, and then continued the rebuilding, completing the temple in about 515. In 445, Nehemiah petitions Artaxerxes to return to Jerusalem to rebuild its walls, a project he completed, if you remember from the book, in just 52 days, accomplishing the wall. But here's what's key there. Nehemiah, after rebuilding the wall, led the people to renew the covenant and establish proper life in Israel. He reread the covenant to them, and he brought them to a covenant renewal ceremony and said, we want to go back to being faithful Israelites, following the law that God has given to us. And he led the people in that. Now that's key to understanding what's going on here in Malachi. There was a covenant that the people said, we will keep it. We will do what the Lord has told us to do. We will follow the rules and the regulations and all of the accoutrements of the temple sacrifices and feast days and festivals, etc. All these things. We will do all these things. That's key to understanding what's going on here in Malachi. The problem is, as you probably could guess, is that the initial excitement of that covenant renewal had faded. In the approximately 100 years between the days of Nehemiah and this particular time, since the people had rebuilt the temple actually under Ezra and Zerubbabel, that excitement about being back in their homeland and having their temple rebuilt and the covenant and all these things, the excitement faded. It began to wane. Now, you know that's true, right? Any situation. You have a great revival that breaks out. You have a great reformation that comes forward. What happens? Well, over time, the people just kind of slip back into their old ways. They fall back into the old sins. It is what it means to be fallen. And there are 4 specific sins that Malachi points to that have now appeared strongly in the people of Israel, or I should say have been reestablished, have been resurrected from the old days of Israel. The first is the corruption of the priesthood. Nehemiah chapter 13, verses chapter 1 and verse 6 here. And if I am a master, where is my fear, says the Lord of hosts to you, O priests who despise my name? There was corruption in the priesthood. That has been raised up again. Men who are doing this work for their own sake rather than the sake of God. The second is the marriage of Israelites to foreigners or idolaters, a sin that's expressly spoken about in Ezra chapters 9 and 10, but you see it in chapter 2 here, verse 10. Why then are we faithless to one another, profaning the covenant of our fathers? Why are we faithless? Verse 11, for Judah has profaned the sanctuary of the Lord, which he loves, and has married the daughter of a foreign god. Marriage to foreigners and idolaters has once again arisen. The third great sin of the time is the abuse of the poor through robbery and injustice. A key sin spoken of in Nehemiah chapter 5 that he was leading the people to put behind them. But here it again appears in chapter 3 and verse 5. Then I will draw near to you for judgment. I will be swift witness against the sorcerers, against the adulterers, against those who swear falsely, against those who oppress the hired worker and his wages, the widow and the fatherless, against those who thrust aside the sojourner and do not fear me. Once again, the abuse of the poor. And then the fourth, and you could make a pretty good argument that this is the worst one, the withholding of the designated tithes. Nehemiah chapter 10, spoken of there, and appears again in chapter 3 and verse 8 and following, when the prophet says, will man rob God? Yet you are robbing me. So there's corruption of the priesthood, marriage of Israelite to foreigners, abuse of the poor, and the withholding of the designated tithes. Or you could expand that last one into basically abandoning the totality of the proper worship of God. Sound familiar? Should. Now, I will say this, in all fairness, by this particular point, the Israelites had in fact put off much of their paganized worship. If you read the gospel accounts, again, in the Old Testament, right? If you read the gospel accounts, you will see that the Jews of Jesus' day were meticulous about making sure that there were no idols in Israel. So they did, in fact, have some success in putting out the pagan worship, and they were fastidiously careful about such things. But the problem is that God's not impressed when you keep one aspect of his law and violate three others. That doesn't make sense to him. It shouldn't make sense to us either. So the people fall back into these sins, and as is typical, God sends judgments on the people for their sinfulness. He sends upon them judgments. Haggai and Zechariah had encouraged rebuilding of the temple back in the days of Ezra and Zerubbabel with the promises of God's blessings, the engrafting of the nations to Israel, to prosperity, and the return of God's presence. In other words, these two prophets came and said, look, rebuild the temple, and God will come back, and he will occupy this temple, and his presence will be here, and you will enjoy his presence. But here's what's interesting. If you read Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, it is conspicuously absent. And there are no evidences, no miraculous evidences of God's presence mentioned in those narratives. In fact, in chapter 3 and verse 10, which reads, bring the full tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and thereby put me to the test, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open the windows of heaven for you and pour down for you a blessing until there is no more need. You will notice that God is pouring out the blessings from where? From heaven, not from his temple. He has not come back down to this particular place. And God's presence is not visible in the newly built temple, one that was, in the eyes of the people themselves, far inferior to the one built by Solomon. You go read Ezra chapter 3 and verse 12. The people wept over this temple that they built because it just didn't have the beauty and the wonder and the splendor of the one built by Solomon. It was a poor replicant of what was originally there. But what they're really weeping over is that God's presence does not come down into that temple. At least when Solomon dedicated the temple, it was filled with the smoke of the presence of the Lord, but that wasn't the case here. And additionally, not only did God not come back down, but the inhabitants of Judah during this time felt their subjugation under Persia and persistent opposition from their neighbors. You see it in both Ezra 4 and Nehemiah 4 as they're rebuilding the temple, and as Nehemiah's attempting to rebuild the wall, they're being attacked by people around them for doing so. And they felt the deep level of that subjugation, first under the Persians, and then under the Greeks, and then under the Romans. And by the time of Jesus, they are in full-blown subjection to a worldwide empire that has made them nothing but a small vassal community in an off area of the world. In fact, the reason why Pilate was sent there is because nobody else wanted to go. Thus, the audience of this book is a ragtag group of refugees living in a tiny space in their original homeland, ruled by a foreign power, opposed constantly, and falling back into many of the same spiritual conditions that had led them to be overthrown in the first place. It's a lovely time in Israel. Now, how many of you would agree with me that the sentence I just read applies to us? Let me read it again. The audience of this book is a ragtag group of refugees living in a tiny space in their original homeland, ruled by a foreign power, opposed constantly, and falling back into many of the same spiritual conditions that had led them to be overthrown in the first place. That, my friends, is the relevance of this book. Malachi could preach to us just as much as he could preach to 5th century BC Israelites. So this becomes the warning of the book. Be careful that you do not perceive your outcast place as an excuse for falling back into sin. Or something like this: God doesn't care about us anyway, so we can do what we want, right? That's a very real danger. It always comes in the heart of men. We must be careful. You know, God has ordained us to be small and unimportant. But that doesn't mean that he's not concerned about who we are and does not demand that we remain faithful to him nonetheless. We may be small and unimportant, but we are not small or unimportant to God, which is precisely what Malachi is saying to his people. You may be small and unimportant. You may be buried under opposition. But do not think that God is not concerned with you, because he is. In fact, he's so concerned about you, he's going to send the Christ to you. He's going to send the Christ to you. You are ready. Now, what's the purpose of this book then, beyond that, all right? What is it that Malachi is trying to accomplish? Now, have you noticed that the genre of this book is not prophetic in nature? You might assume it is. And yes, there is much prophecy in the book, but its genre is not actually prophetic. Its genre is actually more prose than it's more prose than it is prophecy. In fact, really more of it is commentary. And it does not use the normal mode in delivering the various oracles of judgment and salvation. Malachi, as one of the minor prophets, is very, very different from the others. Another reason I really like this book is because it's so very different from the others. It stands out against the backdrop. Now, obviously, Jonah did too, right? Jonah, as a minor prophet, he was, it's all about the story of Jonah. Same thing here. It's very unique as compared to the other minor prophets. In fact, the primary method that Malachi uses to make his point, another reason I like this book, is because he uses satire to make his point. He uses satire. He attacks each of these vices in Israel using satirical language, with the satirical norm being the law of God, over against which the sin is compared. I even read to you a few verses as we've gone on. Will you rob God? Right? That's satirical. You think you can rob God? So the method is satirical. The genre is satirical. The intention is satirical. But the methodology that he uses is a series of questions and answers. So he uses satire to ask the question and then gives the answer that the people would give from that particular point to demonstrate their foolishness, demonstrate their wickedness. So he uses this form of questions and answers. The questions are posed by the people, which are then answered by God. So the people say, well, wait a minute now. When did we do this? And when did we do that? And God comes along and says, let me tell you where. And the question is in the form of satire, or the answer, I should say, is in the form of satire. It's designed to make a point. You listen to a good comic, and usually a good comic, a clean, good comic, just talks about everyday life, doesn't he? He just talks about things from everyday life, but he points out the funny in everyday life, and we laugh at it. And we laugh at it because it's real. We look at it and go, that's preposterous. You're right. I never noticed that before. That's funny. That's what Malachi's doing. Let me point out to you your sins and your flaws by using humor to do so. Now, this book has a very interesting outline to it. Okay, it's a very easy outline. We may get lost in the weeds, and I'll go back every once in a while and remind us of how this book is done. But it uses a series of disputations in a chiasm. Okay, a chiasm is a framework in which the two outer ends are the same, and then the next two inner ends are the same, and then the two center are the same. That's called a chiasm. So it's say something, and then at the end of the book, say it again. Then say something, and then near the end of the book, say it again. And then in the middle of the book, say something, and then say it again. So the structure would be A, B, C, C, B, A, right? Say A, say B, say B, say C, say C. A, B, C, and then C, B, A. That's the structure, okay? Now, I'll just put it for, I'll lay it out for you, and this is probably the structure that we'll take. The A then would be in chapter 1, verse 2 through 5, the love of God for his people, over against the people dishonoring him. So the contrast of a God that loves a people who dishonor him, that's A. And then B, 1:6 to 2:9, is the begrudging offerings of the people condemned. The begrudging offerings of the people condemned. And then C is the marriage of some to idolaters. Remember those sins I talked about? Okay, there they are. The love of God for his people over against them dishonoring him, A. The begrudging offerings of the people condemned, B. And the marriage of some to idolaters, condemned, C. All right, now, C prime then would be the Lord as witness against adultery. Okay, that goes back against the people marrying idolaters. And then B prime would be the Lord as a witness against robbery, and this robbery is against him. Not against people, but against him. So that's repeating what you saw back in B, the begrudging offerings of the people. And then the repetition by God again of his original point, the distinction of God between his people and the wicked. God's elective love vindicated in the coming of a special day. So he's going to expand his love for them and talk about why his love is going to come out. Okay, so you see that structure. Again, I'll repeat it as we go along, so we'll stay put with it. But the total summation of the book comes in the last three verses, 4, 5, and 6 of chapter 4. When Malachi writes, quote, this is God speaking, "Remember the law of my servant Moses, the statutes and rules that I commanded him at Horeb for all Israel. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And he," that is Elijah the prophet, "will turn the hearts of fathers to their children, the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree for utter destruction." That he in verse 6 is the Lord of the previous verse. And he, that is the Lord, will turn the hearts of fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction. That is the key of the verse. You people don't love me like you say you do, but I love you. And I love you so much, I'm sending to you the ultimate messenger who is going to turn your rebellion back to me. That's what I'm going to do. In the face of your falling back into the old sins, remember the law of Moses. Remember the promise of Elijah. Remember the promised day of the Lord. Remember the sovereign work of God in the past, but also in the future. So Malachi preaches covenant fidelity to a people who have wandered away from their commitments and returned to the old sins. That's what he does. He preaches covenant, you could say refidelity, okay? Recommit yourself to this covenant that you made a promise to. Your fathers and your grandfathers and your great-grandfathers made this promise as they came back from their exile. They came back. The Lord granted them the mercy to come back. They committed themselves to this covenant. I'm calling on you, Malachi says, I'm calling on you to maintain that covenant fidelity. And not only does he call them to refidelity of the covenants, but he reveals a promise by God of a great healing to come, where God himself remembers his elective love to them and restores them in his covenant. So it's as though Malachi says, you need to be faithful to this covenant that you promised to be faithful to. And God promises that he will be faithful to his covenant that he's made with you. And to prove it, he's going to send one who's going to establish an even greater covenant over you. It's a transition book into the New Testament, obviously. It sits at the end of the Old Testament, at least the written Old Testament. It's a transition into the New Testament and the coming of the Messiah. Malachi preaches a message of God's grace in the face of rebellion, a rebellion that's been going on for nearly 1,000 years, since the days of the Exodus. In fact, it's a situation that's been going on for 1,000 years and is utterly unfixable by the people themselves. They have been faithless for 1,000 years. But God has not abandoned them, nonetheless. It announces a messenger coming before the Christ, obviously, who will herald a day of judgment. Malachi preaches a message not only of God's grace, but a message of God's power. A message of God's power in the face of sin. The power of God to overcome the rebelliousness of men through the heralding of the one who is to come and his gospel. See, it's not just a message of God's grace, but it's a message of God's power as well. God says, look, you've been struggling with this for 1,000 years, and you haven't been able to fix it. But I have the power to fix it. I have the power to bring about true covenant with myself. And that's what my herald is coming to do. That's what my Christ is coming to do. Which means that it also announces the day of the Lord. Verse 2 of chapter 4, the Son of Righteousness rising with healing in his wings. Malachi not only preaches God's grace and God's power in the face of sin, but he also preaches the message of God's salvation in the face of condemnation. The righteousness of God himself coming to replace the failed self-righteousness of men with the real thing. Instead of a false, fake, and arbitrary self-righteousness, God is going to come and bring true righteousness, a Son of Righteousness who is going to rise with healing in his wings. So it is very much anticipatory. Condemning the people for their sinfulness, yes, but providing a great hope in the one who will come to bring restoration and spiritual prosperity, all against the backdrop of hopelessness, of subjugation and spiritual darkness and sinfulness and infidelity and all these other things that were going on in Israel. God says, yeah, I know about all those things, but I have purposed to bring the Son of Righteousness to rise over you. So what is the value of this book to us? What do we do with this book? There's much in Malachi that turns the attention of Israel, of course, forward to the coming of the Christ. This is the idea of the book. Here we are at the end of our history in anticipation of the one who's to come. So let me tell you about what's coming. Okay? That's the idea of pressing forward. Specifically, this one who is going to come as the great high priest, the one who is going to be perfectly faithful to serving as the true mediator between a people loved by God and the God who loves them. A mediator who's going to mediate between a people who are loved by God and the God who loves them. This is the one. who is going to come. So for us, this prophecy, this book, is a great reminder of what it means to have already seen the coming of the Messiah in Jesus Christ. And seen tangibly God's grace, God's power, and God's salvation, which Malachi preached of. When we read this book, we're going to go, that's right, we've seen that. We've seen the Son of Righteousness who has risen and has turned our hearts away from idolatry, who has turned our hearts back to faithfulness, who has given to us the promise of God's love. We've seen it. To truly know how Christ has served and is serving as the great high priest, as the one making sacrifice for us, the one who sits now at the right hand of the Father, interceding for us, and not only interceding for us, but holding us fast in our covenant commitments. Do you see that? We keep our covenants not because of our strength, but because of His. Because He holds us faithful to Himself. These were people flailing, desperately trying to keep their covenant commitments. They keep falling away from it generation after generation after generation until the Son of Righteousness comes. And He keeps His people in a covenant relationship. All that we have seen in the view of Christ that was given to us in Colossians, we must not forget. It's easy to forget what we've learned, isn't it? It's easy to slip back into the old ways. It's easy to come and talk about the preeminence of Christ and how He is all in all and everything in everything. In Colossians, it's easy for us to do, and then we turn a new year, and it's easy for us to, kind of drift away. Oh, yeah. Preacher talked one time about the preeminence of Christ. I don't know what that means. I've forgotten. It was a long time ago. That's easy, isn't it? So part of the reason for me choosing this book is because it is a reminder to us that we do have a tendency to slip back from our covenant commitments. But the good news is that we have a Christ who holds us fast to those commitments. It's His power. It's His grace. It's His salvation. And it's His covenant that He holds us fast within. As we start a new year, then, it is important for us to resolve to stay fixed on Christ. But our resolution to stay fixed on Christ is only possible by the power of Christ Himself, to remember what He has come to do and to actively keep our covenant commitments to Him. And to one another as a church family.